Hi, my name is Adam Shoemaker, and I'm rector here at St. Stephen's Episcopal Church in downtown Charleston, back for another edition of Rector's Corner, and a very important one because I am pleased to have with me today Doctors Robert Ball and Scott Curry, two epidemiologists in our congregation who have helped to advise the clergy and the vestry, the leadership of this church throughout the COVID pandemic to help navigate the uncertain times that we've been moving through for the benefit of us all, to keep all of our members as safe as possible. And I am aware that at this point, all of you should now have the bottom line plans of our intention to reopen. We'll be reopening the office the first Tuesday of June. Happily, all of our staff by that point will be fully vaccinated, and we will be returning to regular in-person public worship in the church the first Sunday of July, which this year will be the 4th of July. We will not be having any reservations or signups or pre-registrations for worship in the church, meaning we will not be worrying about distancing, but we will be encouraging mask use. And the purpose of this conversation today is to dig into why we are doing what we're doing at the present moment. And one thing that really helped to inform our decisions was the all parish survey that was recently put out that many of you responded to. Thank you very much for those who did fill it out. The data from that survey was very helpful in guiding our approach. And that is my first question, is how that survey helped to shape our recommendations and our approach to reopening the campus. And Scott, I will start with you.
Sure. So somewhat to our delight, we found that St. Stephen's is a very highly vaccinated congregation, far in excess of what is currently reported in the US numbers or DHEC state numbers. So we came in, depending on how you slice the data, at 84 to 87% of folks intending to come back to worship in person vaccinated. And that's including children that are in an age range where they just cannot be vaccinated by that date. That calculation was made and the survey was distributed just before the announcement was made that children 12 to 15 can be vaccinated. So I expect that number will only go up by the time of an in-person go live date for St. Stephen's. So that was the bottom line, is we are very highly vaccinated compared to the US, which is, depending on the day you look at the CDC website, hovering in the mid 30s to low 40s, fully vaccinated, depending on the age group you're looking at in the US state. South Carolina is lower than that.
That is very heartening, and certainly was, I think, an expectation and a hope that we at St. Stephen's were a pretty pro-vaccine group, but it was wonderful to get those results. Do you have anything to add to that, Robert?
Scott did a great job with that survey, and kudos to him and you and others for working it. The other things that came out of the survey were the issues of masks, which there seemed to be some mixed opinion, but mostly in favor of, for now, continuing masks. And we can get into that in a moment.
Well, and that does lead to my next question, because the CDC has, of course, put out new guidance saying that fully vaccinated people can be without masks outdoors and indoors now. And yet we will begin in July, continuing to encourage people to wear masks indoors during worship. And I wonder if you can speak to why we would still recommend that. Scott, why don't you start?
I've said since the beginning of the pandemic that if you don't like the CDC guidance on something, just wait 10 minutes. In this case, we had to wait longer than that. We last had public worship guidelines revised from February 2021. But as you mentioned, the guidance has kind of come out without any attention to the fine print. And the fine print is, if you're indoors with a group that's overwhelmingly vaccinated, what they're telling people may actually hold up as a safe measure. But we don't know that yet. We don't really have a way to verify or check people's papers coming into any indoor gathering in the US right now. So I'm waiting with bated breath to see if the CDC guidance results in big outbreaks inside South Carolina prisons, hospitals, other places. Now, fortunately, hospitals are not going ahead with the idea that we can just go without masks, even though inside the hospital, we know the workforce is very highly vaccinated. So CDC has a tight rope to walk, but the tight rope is really, really going to be difficult when you have people getting into tight indoor spaces unvaccinated and bringing COVID into those spaces, because then it's a risk to the unvaccinated folks in those spaces. You're putting people at risk who aren't responding to their vaccines, which vaccines are not 100% effective and particularly less effective in some certain vulnerable groups like organ transplant patients, patients on certain immunosuppressive drugs, the extremes of age. So their CDC guidelines may hold up for the average indoor population, but may not. And that's going to be a great concern of mine as this is enacted, what we're going to see inside buildings, schools, churches. And I think the fine print of the recent CDC guidance, if you read it, is you really should consider continuing to mask until you know that there's almost universal vaccination within that indoor population. I'll turn it over to Robert for his thoughts too, because he's got to deal with the public facing implications of these new guidelines as well.
Great points about the vaccine. We all know, and this is important to state and restate, the vaccines are not 100% effective. The Pfizer and Moderna mRNA-based vaccines are 94, 95% effective against death, hospitalization, ventilation, severe, moderate illness, but they are somewhat less effective against mild or asymptomatic disease, which means that even if you are fully vaccinated, 2 doses of the mRNA Pfizer, Moderna, or 1 dose of the Johnson & Johnson or AstraZeneca when it comes out, then you still have a risk of catching and even transmitting the virus, but at very low levels. The good thing about the vaccines is they really help boost your immune system to keep the virus down low. A second concern I have with these variants that we've all heard about are mutants. You can use those terms interchangeably, variants and mutants. And just about every week or month, there's a new variant of concern that is impacting most of the population. Scott can address the details of the variants, but long story short, over 90% of the variants in South Carolina and in many states are more transmissible, and they are mutants of the original strain that came out over a year ago. So these variants still concern us. Third thing that concerns me is congregating people together, unmasked in crowds, particularly indoors. And we have Memorial Day and the 4th of July coming up, and there will be indoor and outdoor activities. The CDC has recently said outdoor activities are much, much less of a risk than indoor. Or to put it euphemistically, the breeze tends to blow the viruses away, which is okay. And we see outdoors people going unmasked now, especially after the governors of various states mandates to drop mask requirements. But indoors with crowds, particularly in bars, young people, they are the most susceptible. And we worry about them until we can get younger people, the 12 to up to 16-year-old, 15 plus vaccinated. We still have a risk group there to deal with. And I think time will tell. Like Scott said, every day there are new guidelines somewhere, and we just have to be news junkies to keep up with them.
Well, and let me say right here for those listening that some might be listening in thinking, well, then why don't we mandate full vaccinations for people to come to church? I want to say as the priest that I do not believe that that is what a church, let alone a church like ours, is called to do. It would obviously be unwieldy But certainly from a theological standpoint, I would say that we do not want to be in the business of creating different classes of people. I'm grateful that we are already as fully vaccinated as we are. But I do think as we reopen the church to the public, there will likely be people, certainly minors who may be worshiping with us in the building, who will not be vaccinated. And to put a mask on is another way for us to love our neighbor as ourselves and to practice that as a Christian value during what is still a precarious time as we return to reopening the building. Anything else to add, Scott, on that point?
I agree. I think putting on a mask is essentially an act of love and an equalizer in a time when we can't get everybody vaccinated. It's just not going to be logistical or legal to do it for your 8-year-old child, for example, to cite my own example. And, you know, I will put a mask on Silas and Titus until such time as I can get the jab for those two. So I think that's going to be part of making St. Stephen's truly a house of prayer for all people. Is masks help us realize that goal, because there won't be a time until much later this calendar year when we really can actually have equal access to vaccination. And even when that time comes, vaccination is the single most important way we can prevent outbreaks of COVID in any indoor space, including church. But it's just not 100% effective. We have to have some way to protect ourselves from the inevitability that someone will at some point have COVID in church. Masks will be an excellent protection beyond the layer of protection we get from vaccines until we get to a really low rate of COVID in our community. And that day will come. It's just not here yet.
Well, and that, Scott, leads me to my next question about when that day might come. But I see Robert's hand. Why don't you go ahead, Robert?
Well, Scott, and you make good points. We chose July as return month to give June an opening of the office as a test month, a gray zone. And July will be a gray zone for us because it's summer choir, low services, informal, without a lot of congregating. We are not going to be vaccine passport requirements. We will not have mask police. We will not be tapping people on the shoulders to sit further apart. After all, we're a house of worship for all people. So please, if you feel at all uncomfortable about the people around you, bring a mask, put it on if you need to. Those of us in the choir have an extra duty, of course, and we'll address that with Wayne and Adam as the time comes. But you may hear a muffled choir in the process also.
Yeah, I think that's also a very good point to make, Robert, that we are encouraging the use of masks. You're going to see leaders using masks, but we will not also be in the business of policing this. This is, again, something that we recommend, as Scott said, it's an act of Christian love as we return in July, again, during a moment where we're transitioning back, and there certainly is still a threat level in our community. Now, Scott did talk about when that day might come, and that sort of leads me to my final question, which is how would we determine when we could congregate back indoors together without distancing and without the use of masks? Scott?
Well, I think there are two conditions likely very interlinked that will make that possible. One is that the whole state of South Carolina gets to 80+% vaccinated. It's a bit of a distant goal, but I don't think it's undoable. If we're persuasive and we manage our messaging, that's one way that we will get the rates of illness in the community much lower than they are now. The other is that just may happen no matter what, because there is naturally some distancing that goes on in a hot state like South Carolina when it's easier and nicer to be outside for a couple months coming up. So we may just spontaneously see the rate go down so low that masking won't make as much sense because the threat of COVID entering the building will go down. So it's going to be a combination of those metrics that allow us to determine when we truly can just unmask and be done with it. And it may be that it will go away and then we'll come back again because the pandemic may reemerge at a later time with new evolution of new viral variants. So stay tuned.
Do you have anything to add to that, Robert?
Amen. I suspect that we will have more variants and this pandemic will not, quote, go away, end quote, but rather subside to an endemic or tolerable level. I predict also we will have booster shots, perhaps as early as this fall, hopefully in combination with the flu vaccine, making it easier, get 2 for 1. But regardless of those logistics, it's so important to get vaccinated, convince your family, friends, and neighbors to get vaccinated, to protect everyone in the community, to show that you love them and care about them as well as yourself, and to even wear your masks at times when others are not, because again, that's an act of kindness to yourself and to others.
Thank you, Robert and Scott. And I'll also just mention that it is likely, friends, as we move through the summer, that we may put out another all-parish survey. We had nearly 2/3 of our active households fill out the first survey, but just to help us continue to monitor our vaccination rate moving forward, which, as Scott alluded to, will likely continue to rise as more populations are able to be vaccinated in the future. But we do look very much forward to welcoming you back to campus and back to public worship, and are very excited for that day, and grateful for Robert and Scott, who have advised us along the way and will continue to help us to do that so that we can be as safe as we possibly can while resuming in-person worship that I know we've all been missing over the last 15, 16 months. But please don't hesitate to reach out and ask questions of me, of Robert, of Scott, of others on the vestry. We want to keep the lines of communication wide open, but grateful for your presence in our community and for listening in to this important conversation. And please do, as Robert said, go out and get the vaccine for you and your loved one when you are able. I will close this conversation. I'll be back with another edition of Rector's Corner in a couple of weeks. In the meantime, be safe and well, friends, and you take care. Bye-bye.